Well, hi everyone, and welcome to a live edition of Adam's Music Box. And as I said on the previous live edition, one of the things that I can't do, or at least I don't know how to do at this particular junction, is put a background image of the musician or musicians that I'm talking about, but oh well. Today, obviously, is July the 6th, but several days ago on the 2nd, we lost someone who was part of the Frank Zappa family of musicians. But more importantly, Tom Fowler was from an actual family of wonderful musicians, many of whom played in the non related Frank Zappa extended family of musicians, although Zappa would consider them employees. But for the fans, hey, it's all family. So Tom Fowler was a wonderful bass player, and he came into the Zappa lineup in the early 70s and stuck with various Zappa bands throughout that decade. Now, that decade was very important in Zappa history because it marked the transition of Frank Zappa from his original mothers of invention to a more fluid mothers that would constantly evolve. And eventually, the name itself was dropped around mid 1970s, because it wasn't so much a cohesive band by that point, and it had ceased being so already by the tail end of the 60s. But by the mid 70s, it was really Frank Zappa as the maestro of an ensemble playing his music with him. And Tom Fowler was a very, very important part of that transition. Now, that transition also involved bringing added virtuosity to the band, and Tom's bass playing was incredibly virtuosic. He played with many people that were associated with Zappa at one time or another. And that was one of many advantages, pardon me, that musicians had in playing with Frank Zappa's bands that were very grueling, and you couldn't necessarily get rich by playing for Frank Zappa. But what you could do is several things. You'd automatically be on the Rolodex of any musician who is really, really good and who can work well under pressure. Because one of the things that Zappa forced all of his musicians to do was work very hard under pressure. It meant that you were a good sight reader, because Zappa tended to work with musicians who knew how to read. There were some minor exceptions over the years, but by and large, every musician who played in one of Zappa's bands was someone who could really play the hell out of an instrument whilst reading for the first time. For those not so much familiar with the ins and outs of being a musician, sight reading means they plop a piece of sheet music in front of you and you're expected to play it pretty damn well, if not perfectly, the first time through. Now, this is something that session musicians have to do a lot. If you're jamming with a band and sheet music is involved, which it can be in certain genres of music, you're expected to do that. Now, by no means are bad sight readers or even the musically illiterate bad musicians. And when we say musically illiterate, it means people who are unable to read music. There have been some absolutely fantastic musicians who were musically illiterate, and there may even, in some cases, be some advantages to it. Namely, that you're not so caught up in the technicalities and you can really just play what you feel. But when you're playing someone else's music as opposed to your own, or the music that you create either with band members or on a spontaneous improvisational basis, reading is important. And this was something that Zappa demanded of just about all of the musicians who played with him. Now, of course, Tom had two very famous brothers who were in Zappa bands, and this was the great trombonist Bruce Fowler and the great trumpeter Walt Fowler. And of course, there were times that multiple Fowler brothers were in Zappa bands all at once. I said on an earlier video about what I think the best Zappa albums are, and I like his live stuff, particularly from the 80s. Now, it was in the 80s when he released another set of live albums that weren't all documenting a single tour. At the end of the decade, he released three albums, two of which were double albums, documenting his last great tour. Well, his last tour, but it was a great tour. And that was the infamously cut short 1988 tour. Now, those albums were The Best Band You Never Heard in Your Life. Before that, Broadway the Hard Way. And at the very end, Make a Jazz Noise Here. But it was also around that same time that he began to compile live recordings that spanned his entire career. And these were released in 6 separate volumes, each called You Can't Do That on Stage Anymore. And some of the best performances from all of the Fowler brothers associated with Zappa were on those albums. And if you listen to it with a hard copy as opposed to on Spotify, Tidal, Amazon, whatever, you can see in the liner notes that were very copious of just who was playing on what track, which time and place the recording was made in, and even technical information about what the performance was recorded on. Was it professionally recorded on multi-track and then mixed to stereo? Was it a sort of bootlegish style recording in terms of quality? Zappa's liner notes alone on the You Can't Do That on Stage Anymore series were well worth the price of admission. Obviously, all of that is on Spotify and all the others, but without the great liner notes. But a hot tip for you, if you're a streaming person, as most all of us are these days, one good place to get those liner notes is on Discogs. You can go and look at the various pressings of the various albums, and they have some pretty good, relatively high resolution in some cases, photos of the liner notes, not just on the Zappa albums that I'm talking about, but on all albums in general. So that's a hot tip. I think that as streaming evolves, they ought to put the complete liner notes up on the server so that when you're listening to an album, you can see. So what was the original gatefold? You can see it. You can thumb through, say that 3 times fast, the pages, scroll left, scroll right, not in that way, boys and girls, but see the whole thing. And obviously, it's very technically possible. It will take up less server bandwidth than the music itself in almost every case, and it really should be done. I think it's high time for audiences like perhaps you listening to me to demand more from the tech companies. They really should make listening a fully immersive experience, just as having a hard copy of a record or a tape or a CD was, and for some people still is, but increasingly fewer in general. So that's something that we can think of. I don't know if I've actually mentioned this in a previous video, but Frank Zappa was actually someone who foresaw the streaming world. He was doing an interview. I can't. It may have been on Carson or Leno or Joan Rivers or one of those big shows in the 80s. And he said that he actually thought that the idea of records and tapes would be obsolete and that there would be high fidelity music coming into your home via a cable, the same cable that would have brought you cable television in the 1980s. And Zappa envisaged it as a kind of pay-per-view, where, for those who don't remember how pay-per-view used to work in those days, when there was a movie or a boxing match, you'd call a phone number, enter the details, and they would send you the boxing match or the movie or any other special event. There were some pay-per-view concerts, believe it or not. That same concept exists, but the term has sort of fallen out of fashion because it doesn't really apply as much in the day of the internet. Things like Amazon and YouTube allow you to rent videos, which is essentially what pay-per-view was. It was like a rental service, but you didn't actually have to go in to the Blockbuster Video or any of those types of places. So Zappa foresaw this, that there would be on cable, and many people actually get their internet on a fiber optic cable, and it would come straight to you. And for Zappa, this would have been highly advantageous because by the 80s, he had lost all hope of working with a major distributing label, and most of his stuff was done through mail order, through Barking Pumpkin. And that was very liberating for Zappa because it means he didn't need to rely on any people like Warner Brothers, who he ended up suing at the end of the 70s, early 80s. And that was a long and, a prolonged, in fact, legal dispute. But this was something that would have allowed him to distribute something over a basic telecommunication services, the cable line. And isn't that what the internet is today? So again, very, very, very ahead of his time. Now, going back to the Fowlers, a very musical family. In fact, there were additional brothers who played with others. As I was said, Tom played with people like George Duke, a Zappa alum. He played with Jean-Luc Ponty, a Zappa alum. He played with a lot of really, really great musicians. Now, this leads me to this concept of the musical family. With people like Tom Fowler dying, are we going to be at the precipice of the end of the musical family? Look at all the bands that were musical families. There were the Isley Brothers, both brothers and cousins involved. The Beach Boys, the Wilsons and their cousins, the Everly Brothers, they were brothers called Everly. Not the Righteous Brothers, they were not brothers in the sense of being relations. Who else have we got? Um, Van Halen, a band of brothers, Alex and Eddie, till the end. Alex, now that Eddie's gone, doesn't even want to play with anyone else, and that is understandable. They had that very close bond since childhood. The Allman Brothers, the entire large band weren't all related, but of course, the ones whose surname was Allman were very, very much related. Hart, Anne and Nancy Wilson, and I know that Anne has recently had a health diagnosis that is something that isn't the best. So she said she'll be fine. Let's continue to hope and to pray that she will be, because Heart were, of course, a great, great band. They rocked harder than most male bands in an era when people thought women couldn't rock. There was actually a female rock band called Fanny, mostly with Filipina American women in it, and they were really good. There's a great performance of them on the West German television show Beat Club that you can see right here on YouTube. They should really pay me for saying that. But the problem with Fanny is the production quality was almost singer-songwritery, but when you saw them live, they could rock. But Heart, really, they really, really rocked. So there is a band of a family band. Going back to Van Halen, it wasn't just the brothers Alex and Eddie. The father, Jan Van Halen, was a very accomplished jazz musician. And the brothers with Jan even played together. They gigged throughout Los Angeles. And there was a great jazz club back in the day. It closed ages ago, called Shelley's Manhole on Cahuenga Boulevard, just north of Sunset. It was owned, of course, by the great jazz drummer Shelley Mann. And the Van Halens played as father and kids in that club, among others, which is an interesting tidbit. Let's think of other bands where there are families of musicians. Um, Oasis, they were big in the 90s. The Gallagher brothers, Liam and Noel. And who else were brothers? Obviously, we're talking about the Fowlers, for people who have just joined, or for people who are, in fact, going to join at a later date. But let's just keep thinking. Who were other bands of brothers or sisters or anything? There was Spirit, and it was, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, it was Randy California's stepfather who was the bold drummer at an age when there weren't many bold people in rock and roll. You might find bold people in other areas of music, but not in rock and roll. So there's a stepfather connection in the late 60s, and they went into the 70s band Spirit. Let us keep thinking on. And don't be afraid. Obviously, I've got a live chat going. I'm going to try to do more of these live events, maybe once a week. If the feedback and if the viewership gets better, maybe I'll begin doing more of these live ones per week. So just thinking about other brothers, going through the Rolodex of the mind. Well, there were the mamas and the papas, but they weren't actual fathers and mothers. But I thought I'd throw that one in just to confuse you anymore. There's, of course, the Sinatra children. Nancy Sinatra had quite a lot of hits in her own right, and Frank Sinatra Jr., who sadly died as well, did quite a lot on the musical circuit, playing the music of his father. Well, Frank Zappa, you can say Dweezil. Dweezil did play on stage with his father, Frank. I see Royce in the house, is in fact in the house. Hi, Royce. Thanks for tuning in. So yeah, Dweezil Zappa, very much a family band who played with Frank, but obviously became very well known for doing his Zappa plays Zappa until Ahmet, one of the other brothers or the younger brothers, sued him over the name. It was all a bit chaotic. I think they may have resolved it. And then, of course, you have Moon Zappa, Moon Unit Zappa to give her full name, and she appeared on the only hit single that Frank Zappa ever had, an accidental hit single, and that was called Valley Girl. I'm sure that you've heard it. Gag me with a spoon. There's another Van Halen connection to the Zappa family because in the sort of early midish 80s, Dweezil released a single called My Mother is a Space Cadet, and it featured Moon on backing vocals, and it was produced by Eddie Van Halen, who played some guitar on the album, uncredited, of course. And people say that it was at that stage where he decided that he wanted to build his own home recording studio. He saw the utility muffin kitchen, the recording studio that Frank Zappa built in his Laurel Canyon home. And so Eddie got the idea of building his own studio, also up in the Hollywood Hills, very close to the Zappa family residence, because he really didn't want the time constraints and the pressures of doing things in a professional studio. Of course, the Van Halen albums, one through Women and Children First, actually, one through Fair Warning, were done at Sunset Sound on Sunset Boulevard in Hollywood, which is still there. But a lot of these big studios are going. United Sound, which when it was owned by Alan Sides, who I had the privilege of meeting several times, that's tottering on the edge. And the reason for this, obviously, Diver Down was done partly at Amigos Studios in Burbank, California, but everything after was done at Eddie's home at 5150. And one of the reasons that a lot of these big studios seem to be going, just reading out here from Royce, just subbed up and hit the bell. I can tell already I like your content. I did excellent. I'm gonna have to watch yours. So thank you, Royce. So let's just, because obviously these live videos are freewheeling and I want to keep them that way. So this battle between the home studio and the professional studio. When artists started to do home studios, the musicians union and others weren't entirely pleased because a lot of people thought that it would give people an excuse not to pay overtime to their salaried session guys. The city of LA wasn't too happy about it. In fact, Eddie actually, when he built 5150, had to lie about it. He had to, in order to get approval to modify part of his home, he had to say he was building a racquetball court. Just imagine Eddie Van Halen on a racquetball court with a bottle of Jack in one hand and a cigarette in the other. But obviously, it was a studio. And there were a lot of people who thought that it would start to interfere. Now, in those days, in the 70s and in the 80s, when Eddie built his, it wasn't so much the case because you needed to be really wealthy to have a home studio that you could actually use to produce records that were high enough quality to sell to people. You could obviously have a rehearsal room at home. You could make some, amateur or semi-pro recordings, but it was in the 80s and even into the 90s to make a home studio that even somewhat came close to the level of your Ocean Waves, your United Sounds, your Cherokee Studios, your Tridents in London, your Olympics in London, your power stations in New York, your Electric Ladylands in New York, etc. You'd need to spend a lot. Now, that began to change pretty rapidly by the end of the 1990s. And what happened then? Well, what happened then is you had the computer, the personal computer, started to get powerful enough to run digital audio workstations. Now, digital audio workstations were initially envisaged by tech developers to simply digitize the professional studio. There was a program in the very early 90s that aimed to do that called Mark of the Unicorn. They went bankrupt, but there was a Yes album called Talk in 1994 that was recorded on that. Traveling Wilburys started playing in Bob Dylan's home studio. Yeah, that's again Royce in the comments. And that would have been in this 80s era, when frankly, bands and artists were getting wealthy enough to do that. But going now, skipping forward to the 90s, you had these digital audio workstations where if you could afford one of the nicer Mac towers, because usually the artistic world at that time was still very Mac driven, the professional world was very Windows driven. That's still kind of true, but less true now than it was then. And in many ways, people talk about how things like the iMac saved Apple's fortunes because Apple was in a really bad state as a company in the mid 90s. Hard to believe that now. But Bill Gates and Microsoft and the companies associated with that operating system, things like IBM, that was still very much doing personal computers, where today they're only professional stuff, servers, etc. Um, Apple was on its ass at that time. And obviously, the iMac and later the iPod really saved its fortune. Steve Jobs came back and they really learned how to market themselves again, as they did in the 70s and particularly in the 80s when the first Mac came out. But another thing that really made Apple's fortunes change is that they really started providing high quality programs that could only run at that time on Apple hardware for the artistic community. And this was true with sort of video editing, Final Cut Pro, and also Pro Tools, and other programs for sound editing and recording. And this began the gradual demise of the great professional studio in your LAs, your New Yorks, your Londons, most big cities, but those are probably the three biggest places for the record industry. Nashville, obviously huge, but generally more for country and Western artists. Chicago had its share of good studios too, and there were other places, Muscle Shoals in Alabama, etc. But what all of these studios had in common, what they all started to lose around that time, is that why should a musician or a band or a record label, we'll get into that in a moment, pay top dollar to rent out these studios when you could have it in some guy's house? So the cost goes from a lot to nothing. Obviously, you're still going to have to pay for the road crew to set things up and to ship things over, but that would still generally amount to be a lot less than renting out these big famous studios. And it also meant that you didn't have to worry about deadlines, because especially when a record label was fronting the money for a band in the studio, unless the band was absolutely huge. So if the Beatles reunited and they went to their label and said, right, book us 6 months at EMI Abbey Road Studios with an option to extend for another 6 months, of course the record company would say yes, because they know that it would be a huge seller. I'm talking now as if this were, let's say, the late 1970s, when all four Beatles could have theoretically done that. Now, obviously, that would be impossible with two of them gone. But for many others, even many very famous bands, the bean counters, as they were called at the record labels, would be weary if the albums ran over schedule. Now, in the 90s, the record labels got increasingly vicious in terms of their cost cutting. In the 70s and somewhat in the 80s, they were pretty freewheeling. There are a lot of reasons for that, but the real reason, which isn't what you might find in a history book, is because it was a rare time in history when the executives and the artists were doing the same drugs. And so there was some bonding over cocaine at that time in music history. And I know it sounds silly, but it's true. And Frank Zappa wrote a song about it called Cocaine Decisions, which parodied the fact and really reported the fact that that was at that time the drug of choice for anyone who was professional. Cocaine Decisions. You are a doctor or a lawyer. You have an office with a foyer. God, I love it. But that was factually true in the 70s and 80s. By the 90s, the drugs changed, and therefore so did the personalities. And the music industry was riding high. I mean, think about it. Food is more expensive than it was 3 years ago, let alone in the 1990s. mortgages and rents are way more than they were 3 years ago, let alone in the 1990s. A car is more. Everything just about is more, except music. Music has deflated in terms of its value to the consumer. And part of this is because the distribution of music has changed from one involving a physical medium that needed to be, it needed to have something to make out of it, so plastics, etc., vinyl, etc., magnetic tape. You needed to pay for the packaging, the manufacture thereof, the shipping thereof. So yes, the costs are less despite inflation. But the other thing was that the music industry was screwing the consumer in the 1990s. At some points, in the US, for example, you would pay $18.99 in US dollars for a regular old compact disc, not some special audiophile edition, not some one that, was lithographed with special art or anything, just a regular old CD. You want to get, let's say the year is 1997, you want to buy a regular old Guns N' Roses CD, of which there were many at that time, that'll be $19. Now, Spotify keeps raising their prices over the last few years because of inflation, but I think it's around 11 or 12 now for the premium. Tidal is a bit more, but when you think about that, those services, Amazon Music, Apple, Spotify, Tidal, they give you access to just about every kind of music that was ever made. And if you have Tidal, you can even listen to it in very high quality sound, sometimes 24 192, which is sometimes even higher than the way they record many digital recordings in the early 2000s. And so people were getting screwed by the recording industry. They were riding high, but everything came crashing down. Napster came, and I have a video just about Napster that I shot a while back. I don't know why I haven't uploaded it. Um, I guess I will at some point. So several things in the late 90s happened. Napster was the biggest one, and the music industry handled that about as badly as you could. To quote Zappa, it was like treating dandruff by decapitation. What they should have done is invest in it, acquire it, become stakeholders in it. Because when you have a product that is very successful, even if you don't know how to monetize it at first, some clever boy in accounting will eventually figure out how to do so. So you should snap it up before the competition does. If the music industry did that as either a consortium or if just one record label did that, when you see the proportion of Apple's quarterly revenue that comes from their music services. Same with Amazon. Tidal is owned by the company Block, formerly known as Square. When you see Spotify and their finances, I think they turned a profit for the first time just recently. The record labels could have been in that position because all it would have taken was a bit of time to figure out, right, if we keep the convenience, maybe find out how to make it more convenient, increase the quality, people will be willing to pay a little bit per month if the free alternatives are really bad. And that's eventually what happened. But instead, they tried to sue Napster out of existence rather than try to work with Napster and figure out how to make their business model work with the business model of the music industry. So they wasted their time and money and withered away what little goodwill they still had left by suing Napster. And all that did was lead to Napster's 2.0 and 3.0, LimeWire, Kazaa, and others that came around that did the same thing. And yeah, they were sued, but the music industry was playing a cat and mouse game that they could not possibly win. So Steve Jobs comes along and said, right, here's what we're going to do. We're going to come up with a really, really convenient way to do legally what Napster and the others were doing. But here's the catch. I'm going to set the price point, not you people. And the music industry panicked. And Steve Jobs basically told them, take it or leave it. Take my deal of selling every song on a record for $1. Don't bundle it. If someone just wants track 7 from whatever album and they want to pay $1, Boom, done. And the music industry got scared, but he said, look, either do this or you'll just go away, because the only way to stop people from using Kazaa and LimeWire, which unlike Napster had some problems with computer viruses and people uploading some really illegal stuff, and I don't mean pirated music, I mean like horrific stuff, people thought would pay $1 to have something safe, virus free, and simply music. And that's what happened. And then cheap downloads became cheap streaming. And the record industry, as a result, is now more or less playing second fiddle to the tech industry. If you could be the CEO of Spotify, if you could be an executive at Apple, or if you could be the head of a music label, you'd probably want to be the head of the tech companies, because they are now the ones driving the music industry. And a lot of young artists are bypassing the record labels entirely and instead working within the ecosystems of these tech companies, or in some cases working with the tech companies. Look at TikTok. TikTok is really the biggest, most innovative music label of today. Does that mean that the quality of music being produced on TikTok is good? Mm, I'll leave that up to you and your imagination. So, getting back to what we were talking about, musical families. Look at Rick Beato, great, known for being more of a music educator, but obviously he was and is a musician, and he came from a musical family. His father, his brother, I believe his mother too. I'm trying to think of some others. We've named a lot thus far. Um, I'm sure others will come to me, and I'm sure as soon as I stop doing the live and people start jumping in the comments when they get to watch it in the time zone of their choice, I'm sure they'll be able to find that. I guess we're running close to the end of this here. Don't forget to like and subscribe and to share. It's still a relatively new channel, but people are flocking to it. And long may that continue, so that hopefully I can buy some better lighting and whatever. But again, we're talking about music, and that's what it's all about. So like and subscribe. And of course, the way that we began today was remembering the immensely talented Tom Fowler, who died on the 2nd of July, just a few days ago. Like, subscribe. We'll see you next time. Take care.